Okay, today we're interviewing Hannah Middleton, the author of a book called But Now We Want the Land Back. This book was printed in 1975 and we're 1 year off the 40th anniversary of this book being printed. I want to go back to the beginning of the book in a sense. You arrived at Daguragu, Wattie Creek, in 1970, 4 years after the Gurindji walked off the Wave Hill station. Explain what the walk-off was about.
In some ways there was quite a history to it. Aborigines had been an indispensable part of the cattle industry in the Northern Territory, but for a long period they weren't paid, they just got rations, which was basically tea, flour, beef. Then later on they began to get some money, and the trade union movement took an equal pay case, and put simply the decision was that yes, Aborigines should eventually get equal pay with white stockmen, but the eventually was the catch. They had to wait a number of years. And the response to this was for Aboriginal beef cattle workers and their families to walk off Wave Hill Station, which was owned by Vesties, and also some of the surrounding stations. And they trekked to Daguragu, Wattie Creek, which was a traditional important place for them, with some sacred sites in close proximity, and there they camped. But what they did then was to startle many people by asking for their land back, and this was a new dimension to what it appeared to be an industrial struggle. And from there, although they weren't the first to raise the question of land rights, but from there a land rights movement of considerable strength developed in the south as well.
Why were you there?
Well, I'm teaching English language and society at Humboldt University in East Berlin. And there I had met an anthropologist called Professor Fred Rose, who had done research on Aboriginal kinship amongst the people on Groote Island. Now, I had originally been interested in the position of women in West Africa, and had in fact learnt Hausa, the language of North Nigeria, and had visited Nigeria and so forth. But talking with Fred and reading some of the books he gave me developed for me an interest in the Aboriginal people, and particularly in this struggle at Wattie Creek. And so I came out to live with the Gurindji for 8 months, and permission to go and permission to visit them was mediated on my behalf through the union movement in Darwin, and I got myself as far as Catherine, and in Catherine I joined up with a small convoy from Melbourne students from Abscol who were going up to try and do some house building, and I travelled up with them.
What were the conditions like at the camp in 1970?
Oh, it was fairly sparse. People were basically camping out in the open, or had small humpies made of corrugated iron. Water was got by climbing down the cliffside to the creek itself and then bringing it up in 10-gallon drums on a yoke. We collected wood for fires every day. Food was very restricted. I spent 8 months, during which I think I ate 1 cabbage and maybe half a dozen onions. Otherwise, we lived on tin beef damper, which was flour and water basically cooked in the coals, and tea, which had powdered milk and sugar in it. So that, vitamin C, fruit, things like that were really non-existent.
Explain the campaign regarding the
They were offered houses.
Keep going, sorry.
The Gurindji just stayed at Wattie Creek. Whatever they were offered houses, and at one stage there was a pump to pump up water, various things, all of which they politely accepted and then went on about, but we want our land. Eventually, under the Whitlam government, they were granted a small area of land at Daguragu, not the whole of their traditional land by any means, but at least they had the right to some land. And they began to develop cattle stations and so forth. But then, of course, more recently came the intervention. And Gurindji land was one of the areas which was taken over by the army and the police, and the rights of the people, their autonomy, their ability to make decisions about their own lives were removed.
Okay. The book, But Now We Want the Land Back, was written because of a promise you made. What was that promise you made?
Yeah, I promised the old men particularly that I would write the story of the Gurindji and try and explain the way their society worked to ordinary people. Now, I was doing research for a PhD, and that required a certain kind of language. So, But Now I Want the Land Back is not actually a sort of republication of my thesis. It's a reworking deliberately into a more popular science book. And it was published for me in the German Democratic Republic, which still existed then, at a very, very cheap price. And we here in Australia were given boxfuls for free so that we could give it to people in the Aboriginal community, in the white community, for something like $4 or $5, so that the ideas could be spread. And that was a gesture of solidarity from the government of the GDR.
The publication was 1975. Next year is the 40th anniversary of the publication of the book. Do you think it's achieved some of its aims?
To a small extent. I mean, I think that it's interesting. I find many people, when I meet them, have actually read it and are very interested by it and feel that they learnt more. It's been translated into Russian and into Greek, so that it's gone a bit wider. So I think it contributes to the efforts by many people to share with the wider community the reality of the Aboriginal experience. And of course, more recently, that's being done more by the Aborigines themselves, more and more by them. And we have, films and books and television which are Aboriginal controlled, and that's a fantastic development.
You've been invited to go back to Daguragu and you're just about to go. What are your expectations of your trip there?
Well, I'm going back for two events. Every year, Freedom Day, 22nd, yeah, sorry. I'm going back for two events. Freedom Day is celebrated around the 22nd of August every year, acknowledging the walk-off and the transformation, really, of Gurindji society, because that community has remained at Daguragu and the neighbouring close-by township of Gurindji ever since they walked off in 1966. So in a sense, the struggle continues. Now, I'm going up for that celebration,